They are crashes that people call accidents, a mistake, a terrible second on the road, a moment that went wrong before anyone could stop it. But then there are crashes that leave people asking a darker question. What if the road was not the danger? What if the car was not out of control? What if the driver knew exactly where she was going? On a quiet morning in Strongsville, Ohio, a Toyota Camry slammed into a brick building at nearly 100 miles per hour. Inside that car were three young people, Dominic Russo, Davion Flanagan, and Mackenzie Shirilla. Only one of them survived. At first, it looked like a tragic crash. A young driver, a destroyed car, two families broken forever. But months later, investigators would say this was not just a crash. Prosecutors said it was intentional. A judge agreed. And that is why years later people are still fighting about one question. Was Mackenzie a reckless teenager who lost control, or did she turn a car into a weapon? To understand why this case becomes so controversial, we have to go back before the crash, before the courtroom, before the headlines, before one quiet road became the center of a murder case. Mackenzie was a teenager from Strongsville, Ohio. She was 17 years old at the time of the crash. Dominic Russo was her boyfriend. He was 20 years old. Davion Flanagan was their friend. He was 19. To the outside world, this looked like a group of young people living the kind of life many teenagers and young adults live. Friends, car, social media, late nights, relationship that looked intense from the outside but private from everyone else. But behind the surface, investigators later focused on Mackenzie and Dominic's relationship. The court heard that the relationship had serious tension. There were arguments, there were breakups, there were claims of threats and emotional conflict. And according to prosecutors, those problems matter because the state's theory was simple and chilling. They argued Mackenzie was not just driving too fast. They argued she made a choice that ended two lives. But in the beginning, nobody watching from the outside knew that. All anyone knew was that on July 31st, 2022, something terrible happened on Alameda Drive. It was early in the morning. The streets were quiet. Most people were still asleep. Mackenzie was driving a Toyota Camry. Dominic and Davion were passengers. Then, according to investigators and court records described in local reporting, the car reached extreme speed before striking a brick building. There was no normal crash scene, no simple fender bender, no small mistake that could be walked away from. When emergency responder arrived, all three people inside the car were unconscious and trapped. Dominic and Davion were pronounced dead at the scene. Mackenzie survived, but she was badly injured. And in that first moment, the story looked like a nightmare accident. Two young men gone, a teenage girl in the hospital, families waiting for answers that no parent should ever have to hear. But as investigators studied the crash, the case started to shift. They looked at surveillance video, they looked at vehicle data, they looked at the route, they looked at the speed, they looked at wherever the car braked. And slowly the question changed. It was no longer only how did this happen, it became why did this happen. That question is what turned this case into something far bigger than a deadly crash. Prosecutors argued that Mackenzie did not simply lose control. They said she intentionally drove into the building. They pointed to the speed of the vehicle. They pointed to evidence that the car was traveling close to 100 miles per hour. They pointed to the lack of braking. They pointed to the path of the car, and they argued that the crash was deliberate. For the family of Dominic and Davion, the courtroom was not just about a wrecked car. It was about intent, because intent changed everything. If a driver makes a reckless mistake, the law sees one kind of case. But if a driver aims a car with a purpose, the law sees something else entirely. Murder. That was the word prosecutors used. And that was the word Mackenzie's defense pushed back against. Her side argued this was not a planned killing. They argued there were other possible explanations. Over time, Mackenzie and her supporters have pointed to the possibility of a medical episode. Her later legal team argued that a pre-existing medical condition may have caused her to black out. That claim became part of the reason the case stayed alive in appeal and public debate. But prosecutors did not accept that explanation, and in court, the judge did not accept it either. Mackenzie chose a bench trial. That means there was no jury deciding her guilt. And when the verdict came, it was devastating. In August 2023, the judge found Mackenzie guilty on all counts connected to the crime. That included murder, assault, aggravated vehicular homicide, drug possession, and possession criminal tools. The judge's word became one of the most repeated parts of the case. She said this was not reckless driving. She said it was murder. She described Mackenzie as turning from a responsible driver into hell on wheels. And she said Mackenzie had a mission and executed it with precision. Those words become the center of the public reaction. Some people saw them as justice. Others saw them as too strong. Some believed the evidence showed intent. Others believed the case was being judged through emotion. And that is why the argument never really ended, because this case sits in a disturbing place. It looks like a crash, but the court treated it like a killing. And for many people watching, that was hard to process, because when people imagine murder, they do not imagine a teenage girl behind the wheel of a car on a quiet street. They imagine something more obvious, something more direct, something easier to understand. But the court said the car was the weapon, and that changed everything. At sentencing, the grief in the room was impossible to separate from the facts. Two families had lost sons. Dominic and Davion were not just names in a legal case. They were young men with futures. They had families who expected them to come home. They had people who loved them. They had plans that ended on one road in Strongsville. Mackenzie was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. The sentences were ordered to run at the same time, not one after the other. That means her first chance at a parole is scheduled years after the conviction. But the sentence did not end the debate. It only moved it into a new chapter, because after the conviction, Mackenzie's legal fight continued. Her appeals challenged the case. Her supporters continued to say the crash was not intentional. Her family maintained that there was more to the story. And then years later, the case returned to national attention again. After Netflix documentary brought the crash back into public view, suddenly people who had never followed the trial were watching the case for the first time. They saw a young woman in prison. They saw grieving families. They saw arguments about medical issues. They saw the same question come back again. Was this murder, or was this a tragic crash being misunderstood? But the legal records remained clear. Mackenzie was convicted. Her conviction was upheld on appeal. And as of the latest reporting, her legal team has continued seeking review, including arguments connected to a missing filing deadline and claim that medical evidence should have been handled differently. The prosecutor's office has said it remains confident in the conviction. The Ohio Supreme Court has not yet decided whether to hear her latest appeal. That is why the case is still alive in public conversation, not because the original outcome is unclear. The court outcome is clear. Mackenzie was found guilty. She was sentenced. She's serving her sentence. What remains alive is the argument around meaning. What does the evidence prove? What does intent look like when the weapon is a car? How do we separate a terrible accident from a planned act? How much doubt is enough to change a life sentence? Those questions are why people keep returning to this case, because There is something deeply unsettling about it. The crash took only moments, but the consequences have stretched across years. Dominic's family continued to live with the loss of a son and a brother. Davion's family continues to live with the loss of a young man who was not even the center of the relationship conflict prosecutors describe. And Mackenzie's family continue to insist she's not the person the court said she was. 3 families were changed forever. 2 young men never come home, and 1 young woman went from survivor of a crash to convicted murder. That is the part that makes this case feel impossible to look away from. Because of the center of it, there is a haunting idea, a normal morning, a familiar car, a quiet street, and then one decision or one unexplained moment that destroyed everything. The court has already answered the legal question, but the public is still fighting over the emotional one. Can a crash be a murder? In the Mackenzie case, the judge said yes, and for the families of Dominic and Davion, that answer is not just a legal ruling. It is the closest thing they have to justice. But for everyone still watching, the case leaves behind a warning that is difficult to forget. Sometimes the most dangerous moment does not look like danger at first. Sometimes it looks like a car driving down an empty road. And by the time the truth is understood, the silence after the impact is all that is left.